The train pulled away, leaving nothing but dust and broken promises. Lillian Moore stood alone on that forsaken platform in New Mexico, 1878, clutching a letter from a dead man, a stranger's brother who'd promised her everything. No one came. No wedding. No future. Just silence and the crushing weight of 1,000 miles traveled for nothing. Then a barefoot child appeared, asking if she was the angel Mama had sent. What happened next would set a ranch on fire, bring a broken cowboy back to life, and prove that sometimes the wrong destination leads you exactly where you belong. Stay until the end. Hit that like button and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The spring wind carried dust across the high desert like whispered secrets, coating everything in a fine layer of forgotten things. Lillian Moore felt it settle on her traveling dress, a deep blue wool that had seemed so practical back in Boston, but now felt suffocating under the relentless New Mexico sun. She stood on the wooden platform, her leather trunk beside her, one gloved hand shading her eyes as she scanned the empty landscape for any sign of movement. The train's whistle echoed one final time as it disappeared around the bend, leaving her in a silence so complete it pressed against her ears. She had imagined this moment 100 times during the 2-week journey west. In every version, there had been someone waiting, a man with kind eyes, perhaps nervous, holding his hat in weathered hands. Words of greeting, an apology for any delay. The beginning of the life she'd been promised in carefully written letters that smelled of tobacco and hope. Instead, there was nothing. The platform was little more than a raised section of planking beside the tracks, weathered gray by sun and wind. A small shelter with a sagging roof offered shade, but Lillian couldn't bring herself to move toward it. Moving would mean accepting that this was real, that she had traveled 1,800 miles to meet a man who wasn't coming. She pulled the letter from her reticule for the dozenth time that day, unfolding the creased paper with trembling fingers. The handwriting was neat, almost elegant, so different from the rough cowboys and prospectors she'd seen through the train windows. Miss Moore, I cannot promise you luxury, but I can promise you honest work, a home, and a partnership built on mutual respect. The West is hard, but it rewards those brave enough to meet it head-on. If you are willing, take the train to Cimarron Station. I will be there to meet you on April 12th. We can be married by the justice of peace in town, and I will spend the rest of my days ensuring you never regret your courage. Yours, in anticipation, Thomas Hale. April 12th. Today. She had checked and rechecked the date obsessively, terrified of missing the meeting by even a day. But she was here. She had kept her part of the bargain. Thomas Hale had not. Miss? You waiting on someone? Lillian startled, turning to find an elderly man in a station master's vest watching her from the shelter's shadow. His face was creased like old leather, eyes sharp despite his years. Yes, she managed, her throat tight. Thomas Hale. Do you know him? Has there been any message? The station master's expression shifted, something between pity and discomfort crossing his weathered features. He stepped out into the sunlight, moving with the careful deliberation of a man whose joints ached in the dry climate. Thomas Hale, he repeated slowly, as if testing the name. Can't say I know everyone in the territory, miss, but that name, it sounds familiar somehow. Where's he from? I don't know exactly, Lillian admitted, feeling foolish. His letters just said he had a ranch in the territory. He told me to come here to the station, and he would meet me. The old man scratched his jaw, thinking. Well now, Cimarron Station serves a fair bit of territory. Could be he's running late. Roads are rough this time of year with the spring runoff. Creeks running high, washes mud slick. Easy for a wagon to throw a wheel or a horse to pull up lame. It was meant to be comforting, Lillian knew, but it only intensified the knot of anxiety in her chest. How long should I wait? Hard to say, miss. But if you need somewhere to sit out of the sun, the boarding house is just down the road a piece. Mrs. Henderson runs it. She's decent folk, won't charge you much for a room if you need to wait a day or two. A day or two. Lillian calculated rapidly. She had enough money for perhaps 3 nights lodging and meals, maybe 4 if she was careful. After that, she would need to wire back east for funds, which meant admitting defeat, admitting that she'd made a terrible mistake in coming here at all. Thank you, she said quietly. I'll wait a bit longer if that's all right. The station master tipped his hat. Course it is, miss. There's water in the bucket by the door if you need it. I'll be in the office if anything comes up. He shuffled back toward the small building attached to the platform, leaving Lillian alone again with the wind and the dust and the terrible growing certainty that something was very wrong. She sat on her trunk, arranging her skirts carefully, and waited. An hour passed. Then another. The sun climbed higher, turning the platform into a furnace. Lillian moved into the shade of the shelter, but it offered little relief. She drank sparingly from the water bucket, trying to make each cup last, trying not to think about what she would do when the sun set and Thomas Hale still hadn't come. She had been so careful, so methodical in her planning. After her father's death and the loss of their small bookshop to creditors, she'd had few options. Return to her aunt's house in Philadelphia as a charity case, accept a position as a governess with a family that had made their expectations of additional duties uncomfortably clear, or answer one of the advertisements she'd seen in the matrimonial papers. Honest rancher seeks educated wife for companionship and partnership. Must be willing to embrace Western life. Age 25 to 35 preferred. The advertisement had been almost poetic in its simplicity. No false promises of wealth or luxury, just the straightforward proposition of a man who needed a partner and was willing to offer security in return. Lillian had been 28, too old by Boston standards to hope for a love match, too proud to accept charity, and too practical to believe in fairy tales. She had written carefully, honestly, explaining her situation without embellishment. She had education. Her father had insisted she learn literature and accounting both. She could manage a household, keep books, teach children if there were any. She wasn't afraid of hard work, though she admitted she knew nothing of ranch life. But she could learn. She would learn. Thomas Hale's response had come within 2 weeks, and over the next 6 months they had exchanged a dozen letters. He wrote about the land, harsh but beautiful, demanding but rewarding. He wrote about his plans to expand the ranch, his hope for a family, his belief that the West was a place where people could reinvent themselves, shed the rigid expectations of Eastern society, and become something new. Lillian had let herself hope. More than hope. She had let herself believe in the possibility of a fresh start. A partnership built on mutual respect rather than romantic delusion. It had seemed like such a reasonable dream. Now, sitting on a deserted platform with the sun beating down and no sign of the man who had promised her a future, that dream felt like the worst kind of foolishness. "Please," she whispered to the empty air. "Please let there be a reason. Please let him come." But the desert offered no answers, just the endless wind and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. It was nearing late afternoon when Lillian heard the sound of footsteps. Small, quick, not the heavy tread of a man's boots, but something lighter. She looked up from her increasingly desperate study of Thomas Hale's letter to see a child approaching across the dusty road that led from the station toward the scattered buildings of what passed for a town. The girl couldn't have been more than 4 years old, small and slight, with tangled dark hair that caught the sunlight in shades of chocolate and copper. She was barefoot, her simple cotton dress faded and patched but clean. What struck Lillian most were her eyes, large and dark, and impossibly serious for such a young face. The child stopped at the edge of the platform, tilting her head as she studied Lillian with unsettling intensity. "Are you the angel?" the girl asked, her voice high and clear. Lillian blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I'm sorry?" "The angel," the girl repeated patiently, as if Lillian were the child and she the adult. "Mama said when things felt too empty, an angel would come. She promised." Something tightened in Lillian's chest, a mixture of pity and confusion and unexpected tenderness. She set down the letter and leaned forward, trying to make herself less imposing to the small figure watching her. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Maggie." "Maggie Hale." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Lillian gripped the edge of the bench she sat on, her mind racing. Hale. The child's name was Hale. "Maggie," she said carefully, "do you know a Thomas Hale?" The girl's face brightened with recognition. "That's Uncle Thomas, but he's not here anymore. He went away with the soldiers and didn't come back. Papa says he's in heaven with Mama now." The words hit like physical blows. Went away with the soldiers. Didn't come back. Heaven. When? Lillian heard herself ask, her voice sounding strange and distant. When did he go away? Maggie scrunched up her face, thinking. Before the snow came. I remember because Papa said Uncle Thomas was going to help protect people, and I asked if he would come back for Christmas, and Papa said yes, but then he didn't. Her expression grew sad. Papa cried. I heard him at night when he thought I was sleeping. Before the snow came. Winter. It was April now. If Thomas Hale had left in late fall or early winter, that meant he'd been gone for months. And if he'd gone with soldiers and ended up in heaven? He's dead, Lillian whispered. The letter crumpled in her hands as her fingers clenched involuntarily. He's been dead for months. Maggie nodded solemnly. That's what Papa says. Heaven means you don't come back, not ever. Not until we go there, too. Lillian couldn't breathe properly. The air felt too thin, too hot, too empty. She had come all this way for a dead man, had spent her last money on train tickets to meet a ghost, had left everything behind to marry someone who had been in the ground for months while she was still receiving his letters, still planning, still hoping. But you're here now, Maggie said brightly, apparently unaware of the devastation her words had caused. You must be the angel. You're pretty like an angel, with your nice dress and your yellow hair. She reached up and touched Lillian's sleeve tentatively. Will you come home with me? Papa needs an angel too, but he won't say so. He just gets quiet and stares at the hills. Sweetheart, I can't, Lillian began, but Maggie was already tugging at her hand. Please, it's not far. And Papa will help you if you're lost. He always helps people, even when he's sad. Mama said that's what good men do. There was such hope in those dark eyes, such innocent certainty that Lillian was exactly who she needed to be. And what else did Lillian have? Where else could she go? At least with this child, she might find answers about Thomas Hale, might understand what had happened, might figure out what to do next. All right, she said softly. But just to talk to your papa, you understand? I'm not an angel, Maggie. I'm just a woman who came here to meet your uncle, and I didn't know... That's what angels say, Maggie announced with absolute conviction. They always pretend they're regular people first. It's in the story Mama used to tell me. There was no arguing with that logic. Lillian gathered her trunk, lighter than when she'd left Boston, as she'd sold what she could to afford the journey, and let the small girl lead her away from the platform, away from the last place she'd had any certainty about her future. They walked down a dusty road that curved away from the handful of buildings clustered near the station. The town, if it could be called that, consisted of a general store, a saloon, what looked like a blacksmith's forge, and a few other structures Lillian couldn't identify. A handful of people watched them pass. A woman sweeping a porch, two men loading supplies onto a wagon, a dog sleeping in a patch of shade, but no one called out or questioned where Maggie was taking the strange woman with the trunk. How far is your home? Lillian asked, already feeling the weight of her trunk despite its diminished contents. Not far, Maggie said again, which Lillian was beginning to realize was a child's measurement that could mean anything from 100 yards to several miles. In fact, it was perhaps a mile from the station, following the road until it became little more than a wagon track, then cutting across open grassland toward a cluster of buildings nestled against the rise of hills in the distance. As they drew closer, Lillian could make out a house. Simple frame construction, whitewashed but weathered, along with a barn, several outbuildings, and corrals that held a few horses. It was modest, much smaller than she'd imagined when Thomas Hale had written about his ranch. But there was something solid about it, something that spoke of hard work and careful maintenance. The land around it had been cleared, fenced in places, with evidence of cultivation in one section where young plants were just beginning to show green against the brown earth. A man stood near the barn, his back to them as he worked on something Lillian couldn't quite see. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his shirt dark with sweat, despite the relatively cool temperature. As if sensing their approach, he turned, and Lillian got her first clear look at Caleb Hale. He was older than his brother must have been, perhaps 35 or 40, though the sun and hard work had etched lines into his face that made precise age difficult to guess. Dark hair, longer than was fashionable, fell across his forehead. He had a strong jaw, currently shadowed with several days' worth of beard, and eyes that were the same dark shade as his daughter's, but without their innocent brightness. These were eyes that had seen too much, lost too much, and had decided that expecting anything good was a fool's game. "Maggie?" His voice was rough, surprised. "Where have you been? I told you to stay close to the house." "I went to see if the angel came," Maggie announced, pulling Lillian forward with surprising strength for such a small child. "And she did. She was waiting at the station, just like Mama said. She has pretty hair and a big trunk, and she came all this way to help us." Caleb Hale's expression shifted from surprise to confusion to something harder as his gaze moved from his daughter to Lillian. He took in her traveling dress, the trunk, her obvious Eastern origins, and his jaw tightened. "Maggie, go inside," he said quietly. "But, Papa, inside now." Something in his tone made the child obey without further argument, though she cast one worried glance back at Lillian before scampering toward the house. In the sudden silence, Lillian became acutely aware of how isolated they were, how vulnerable her position was. This man was a stranger, and she had just followed his child to his remote ranch based on nothing more than desperation and a little girl's innocent invitation. Caleb Hale approached slowly, wiping his hands on a rag he pulled from his pocket. Up close, Lillian could see the grief etched into every line of his face, the exhaustion that went bone deep, the wariness of a man who had been hurt too many times to trust easily. "Who are you?" he asked bluntly. "And what are you doing with my daughter?" Lillian drew herself up, trying to find some dignity in this impossible situation. "My name is Lillian Moore. I came from Boston to meet Thomas Hale. Your daughter, she told me about him. I didn't know. No one told me." She saw the moment comprehension dawned, followed immediately by something that looked like pain and anger mixed together. Caleb's hands clenched on the rag, his jaw working as if he were physically chewing on words he didn't want to say. "Thomas," he said finally, the name rough as gravel. "You came here for Thomas." "He wrote to me," Lillian said, pulling out the crumpled letter with trembling hands. "We exchanged letters for months. He asked me to come, to marry him. He said he would meet me at the station on April 12th, today. He didn't tell me. No one told me." Caleb took the letter, reading it quickly. She watched his expression close down even further, walls going up behind his eyes that shut out any hope of understanding or sympathy. "When did he send this?" he asked. "It's dated February 10th. It arrived in Boston 3 weeks later, and I made arrangements immediately. The journey took 2 weeks, and I arrived today exactly as planned." Her voice was starting to shake now, the full weight of her situation crashing down. "Your daughter said he's dead. Is that true?" "Yes." The word was brutal in its simplicity, offering no comfort or explanation. "How?" Lillian whispered. "What happened?" Caleb handed back the letter, his movements careful, as if he were handling something dangerous. "There was an Apache uprising in January. Small band, mostly just scared families trying to reach Mexico, but the cavalry went after them anyway. Thomas..." He stopped, swallowed hard. Thomas had been working as a scout, trying to make extra money to expand the ranch. He volunteered to go with the troop. They got caught in an ambush in a canyon north of here. Only 3 men made it out. Thomas wasn't one of them. Lillian's legs felt unsteady. She set down her trunk and gripped it for support, trying to process what he was telling her. "In January? But this letter is dated February." "My brother wrote to a lot of people in the months before he died," Caleb said quietly. "He was optimistic like that, always making plans, always thinking about the future. I found a stack of letters in his room after we got word, all stamped and ready to post. I didn't know what they said. I figured they were just correspondence with his friends back east, maybe some business arrangements. I mailed them because I thought that's what he would have wanted." The implications of that statement were staggering. Thomas Hale had been dead for 3 months, but his letters had continued to arrive, had continued to build a future that no longer existed. Someone, this man standing before her, had unknowingly sent those letters, setting in motion a chain of events that had brought Lillian across the country to meet a ghost. "You didn't read them," she said. It wasn't quite a question, but Caleb answered anyway. No, I was. He looked away toward the hills that shadowed his ranch. I wasn't in a state to be reading my dead brother's mail. I should have. I should have known there might be something important, someone who needed to know. I'm sorry you came all this way. That's a hell of a thing to learn after such a journey. Sorry, Lillian repeated numbly. She almost wanted to laugh at the inadequacy of the word. Sorry. As if sorry could erase the past 6 months of planning, of hoping, of believing she was building towards something real. As if sorry could replace the money she'd spent on train tickets, the possessions she'd sold, the life she'd abandoned. You should stay the night, Caleb said gruffly. It's too late to make it back to town before dark, and the boarding house might not have space anyway. Mrs. Henderson's rooms fill up fast this time of year with the spring drovers coming through. I've got a spare room. It was Thomas's. You're welcome to it. Tomorrow, I'll drive you back to town, help you sort out arrangements for heading back east. It was a reasonable offer, practically generous under the circumstances. But something in Lillian rebelled at the easy dismissal, the assumption that of course she would just turn around and go back to Boston as if none of this had happened. Go back to what? The question echoed in her mind. She had nothing left in Boston. Her father was dead, their shop sold, her few friends scattered to their own marriages and families. Her aunt had made it clear that Lillian's continued presence would be tolerated but not welcomed. The governess position had been filled when she'd turned it down to come west. She had burned her bridges with the absolute certainty of someone who believed they were stepping into a better future. Now she stood in the ashes with nowhere to go. Miss Moore? Caleb was watching her with concern now, as if worried she might faint or become hysterical. Yes, she heard herself say. Yes, thank you. I would appreciate a place to stay tonight. He nodded, picking up her trunk as if it weighed nothing. Come on then. Maggie will be bouncing off the walls wanting to talk to you, but I'll try to keep her from pestering you too much. She doesn't understand about strangers and proper behavior sometimes. Lost her mother 2 years ago, and it's just been the two of us since. She doesn't remember how ladies are supposed to act around company. It's all right, Lillian said softly. She seems like a sweet child. Something flickered across Caleb's face, pride maybe, or grief, or both tangled together. She is. Too sweet for this hard life sometimes. She still thinks angels come when you need them and prayers get answered like letters in the mail. I don't have the heart to tell her different. They walked toward the house in silence, Lillian's mind churning with too many thoughts to settle on any single one. The house was larger up close than it had appeared from a distance, though still modest by Eastern standards. 2 stories with a covered porch that wrapped around the front, offering shade and a place to sit on hot evenings. Maggie burst out the front door before they reached the steps, her earlier solemnity replaced by barely contained excitement. Papa, she's really here. The angel is really here. I told you Mama's promise would come true. Maggie, she's not... Caleb began, but Lillian surprised herself by interrupting. My name is Lillian, she said gently, crouching down to the child's level. You can call me Miss Lillian if you'd like, and I'm going to stay for a little while just to rest and figure some things out. Is that all right with you? Maggie nodded so vigorously her tangled hair flew around her face. Yes, it's perfect. You can stay in Uncle Thomas's room. It has a window that looks at the hills, and sometimes you can see deer in the morning. And I can show you my rock collection and the kittens in the barn and where Mama's garden used to be before Papa let it go wild because he doesn't know about flowers. That sounds wonderful, Lillian said, and was surprised to find she meant it. There was something healing about this child's enthusiasm, her absolute certainty that everything was going to be all right now that Lillian had arrived. If only it were that simple. Caleb carried her trunk inside, and Lillian followed, stepping over the threshold into a life she had never planned for, a future that looked nothing like what she'd imagined, but was somehow, impossibly, the only option she had left. The house was neat, but obviously lacking a woman's touch. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room all in one, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. The furniture was simple but well made, a table with 4 chairs, a pair of rocking chairs near the fireplace, shelves lined with books, and a few decorative items that must have belonged to Caleb's wife. Everything was clean but spare, as if the inhabitants had stopped caring about comfort and focused only on survival. Maggie, show Miss Moore upstairs, Caleb said, setting down the trunk. I'll be outside finishing the fence repair. Supper's in about 2 hours. Nothing fancy, just stew. You're welcome to join us or rest in your room, whichever suits you. He left before Lillian could respond, escaping with the practiced ease of a man uncomfortable with domestic situations. Maggie grabbed Lillian's hand and pulled her toward a narrow staircase. Come on, I'll show you everything. The stairs led to a short hallway with 3 doors. Maggie pointed to each in turn. That's my room, that's Papa's room, and that's Uncle Thomas's room, which is your room now. Papa never goes in there anymore. He says it makes him too sad. She pushed open the door to reveal a simple bedroom, a single bed with a quilt, a washstand, a dresser, and a window that indeed looked out toward the hills. It was a lonely room, Lillian thought, a room for someone passing through rather than building a life. How appropriate. I'll let you rest, Maggie said with the practiced politeness of a child who had been taught manners but didn't quite understand them. But if you need anything, I'll be right in my room, and I'll come get you for supper. Papa makes good stew, but sometimes he forgets the salt, so you have to remind him. Thank you, Maggie. The child lingered in the doorway, suddenly shy. Miss Lillian, are you really going to stay, or are you going to leave like Mama did and Uncle Thomas did? The question cracked something open in Lillian's chest. She crossed the room and knelt down again, taking Maggie's small hands in hers. I don't know what's going to happen, she said honestly, but I promise I won't leave without saying goodbye. That's not much of a promise, I know, but it's the only one I can make right now. All right? Maggie considered this gravely, then nodded. All right. That's better than no promise at all. That's what Papa says. Better something small and true than something big and pretend. She skipped away down the hall, leaving Lillian alone in the dead man's room, surrounded by the scattered pieces of a life that would never be lived. Lillian sank onto the bed and finally let herself cry. The tears didn't last long. Lillian had learned years ago that crying changed nothing, solved nothing, and only left you with swollen eyes and a headache. She allowed herself 5 minutes of grief for the future she'd lost, then wiped her face, straightened her dress, and stood to survey the room that would be hers for at least one night. Thomas Hale's possessions were few but carefully kept. A row of books on a small shelf, mostly practical volumes about animal husbandry and land management, but also a worn copy of Whitman's poetry and a collection of essays by Emerson. A pair of boots stood by the door, cleaned and oiled but never to be worn again. On the dresser sat a leather journal, closed, with a pen laid across it. Lillian's fingers itched to open that journal, to read the private thoughts of the man who had promised her a future and then died before delivering it. But that felt like a violation too far. Whatever Thomas Hale had written was between him and the silence now. She unpacked her trunk methodically, hanging her few dresses in the narrow wardrobe, arranging her toiletries on the washstand, placing her own small collection of books beside Thomas's. The act of organizing calmed her, gave her hands something to do while her mind wrestled with impossible questions. What would she do tomorrow? Where would she go? She had perhaps $15 left to her name, enough for a train ticket east if she traveled in the cheapest accommodations, but not enough to establish herself anywhere once she arrived. She could wire her aunt, beg for help, but the thought made her stomach turn. Her aunt would help, certainly, but the price would be constant reminders of Lillian's foolishness, her impulsiveness, her failure to secure a proper future through proper channels. A knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Miss Lillian, Maggie's voice was tentative. Papa says supper's ready if you want to come down. But he also says if you're too tired, I can bring you a tray. He taught me how to carry trays without spilling. Well, mostly without spilling. Despite everything, Lillian found herself smiling. I'll come down. Thank you, Maggie. She checked her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand, smoothing her hair and pinching color back into her cheeks. Whatever happened tomorrow, tonight she would maintain her dignity and her manners. She owed Caleb Hale at least that much for his reluctant hospitality. The main room had been transformed in her absence. The table was set with mismatched but clean dishes, and a large pot of stew sat steaming in the center. Caleb had changed his shirt and made some attempt to tame his hair, though it still fell rebelliously across his forehead. He looked uncomfortable, standing awkwardly by the fireplace as if unsure what to do with his hands. "It's not fancy," he said without preamble. "Just rabbit stew with whatever vegetables I had left from winter storage. But it's hot, and there's plenty of it." "It smells wonderful," Lillian said honestly. Her last meal had been a stale sandwich purchased at a train station hours ago, and suddenly she was ravenous. They sat, Caleb at the head of the table, Maggie to his right, and Lillian across from the child. For a moment, no one moved, and Lillian realized they were waiting for something. A blessing, perhaps, or some ritual she didn't know. "We don't say words before meals," Maggie explained, catching Lillian's confusion. "Mama used to, but Papa says it feels wrong now, like we're pretending things we don't believe anymore. So we just sit quiet for a minute and think about people who aren't here." It was perhaps the saddest explanation Lillian had ever heard for silence at a meal, but she bowed her head with them and thought about her father, about the bookshop where she'd grown up, about Thomas Hale, who had died without knowing the chaos his letters would cause. Then Caleb ladled stew into bowls, and they ate. The food was good, simple but well seasoned, the meat tender, and the vegetables soft. Maggie kept up a steady stream of chatter, telling Lillian about the ranch, about the horses, about a snake she'd seen last week that Papa said was just a bull snake, but looked scary anyway. Caleb ate in silence, occasionally nodding at his daughter's stories, but offering nothing of his own. Lillian found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't paying attention. There was a heaviness to him that went beyond physical exhaustion, a weight that pressed down on his shoulders and carved deep lines around his eyes. He moved like a man going through motions he'd repeated so many times they'd lost all meaning. Fork to bowl to mouth. Chew, swallow, repeat. "Miss Lillian came all the way from Boston," Maggie announced, as if this were the most impressive accomplishment imaginable. "That's where the tea party was, right, Papa? The one with the ships?" "That's right, sweetheart." Caleb's voice was rough but gentle when he spoke to his daughter, so different from the guarded tone he'd used with Lillian. "Long time ago now." "Do you know about the tea party?" Maggie asked Lillian eagerly. "Did you see the ships?" "That was 100 years before I was born," Lillian said with a smile. "But yes, I know the story, and Boston is a beautiful city, full of history and culture, very different from here." "Did you have a house there?" "I lived above my father's bookshop. It wasn't very big, but it was full of wonderful things. Books, of course, but also maps and prints, and sometimes rare manuscripts that collectors would come to see." "What happened to it?" The question came from Caleb, surprising Lillian. He was looking at her now with something that might have been genuine curiosity. "The bookshop. If it was yours, why leave?" It was a fair question, and Lillian decided he deserved an honest answer. "My father died last year. He'd borrowed money to keep the shop running during some lean times, and when he passed, the creditors came calling. I couldn't pay what he owed, so they took the shop. I tried to find work, but opportunities for single women with no connections are limited. When I saw your brother's advertisement, it seemed like the best of my available options." "What would you have done?" Caleb asked. "If Thomas had been here, I mean, did you know anything about ranch life?" "Not a thing," Lillian admitted. "But I can learn. I'm good with numbers, I can read and write well. I'm organized, and I work hard. I thought those skills would translate somehow. I thought—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I thought if two people were honest with each other about what they needed and what they could offer, they could build something functional, even without romantic attachment." Something shifted in Caleb's expression, not quite approval, but perhaps a glimmer of respect. "That's practical thinking. Thomas always was good at finding practical people. He knew this life wasn't for dreamers." "And yet he wrote poetry," Lillian said, remembering the Whitman on the shelf upstairs. "His letters were beautiful, full of descriptions of the land and the sky. He made the West sound like a place where souls could expand." Caleb's jaw tightened. Thomas was complicated, practical when he needed to be, but with his head in the clouds more often than not. That's what got him killed, thinking he could scout for the cavalry and come home with enough money to turn this place into something grand. Couldn't just accept what we had to always be reaching for more. There was bitterness in his voice, but also grief so raw it made Lillian's chest ache. She wanted to say something comforting, but what comfort could she offer? She was a stranger here, connected to these people only by the thinnest thread of her correspondence with a dead man. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for your loss. Both your losses." She glanced at Maggie, who had grown quiet, sensing the shift in her father's mood. Caleb pushed back from the table abruptly. "I'll clean up. You two can go sit on the porch if you want. It's nice in the evenings when the sun's going down." It was clearly a dismissal, and Lillian took it as such. She helped Maggie carry dishes to the sink despite Caleb's protest, then followed the child outside. The porch was indeed pleasant, with 2 rocking chairs positioned to catch the breeze. The sun was sinking toward the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed impossible in their intensity. Lillian had seen sunsets in Boston, of course, but they'd been muted by buildings and smoke. Here, with nothing but open land in every direction, the sky felt vast enough to swallow the world. "Pretty, isn't it?" Maggie climbed into one of the rockers, her legs too short to reach the floor, so she had to push off with her toes to make it move. "Mama used to say the sky was trying to show us what heaven looked like, all those colors and clouds. She said that's where she'd be someday, painting pictures in the sunset for us to see." "That's a lovely thought," Lillian said, settling into the other rocker. "Papa doesn't like when I talk about Mama," Maggie continued matter-of-factly. "It makes him sad. But I think if we don't talk about people, we start to forget them, and that's worse than being sad, don't you think?" The child's wisdom was startling. "Yes," Lillian agreed. "I think you're right. It's important to remember the people we've loved, even when it hurts." They rocked in companionable silence for a while, watching the sun sink lower. Lillian felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders. Tomorrow would bring its own problems, but for this moment, sitting on a porch in the fading light with a lonely child beside her, she could simply exist. "Miss Lillian," Maggie's voice was small now, uncertain. "Do you think Mama really sent you, or do you think I just made that up because I wanted it to be true?" Lillian considered the question carefully. She could tell the child what she wanted to hear, could reinforce the comforting fantasy, or she could be honest. "I think," she said slowly, "that sometimes people need help, and sometimes other people show up at just the right moment. Maybe that's what your mama knew would happen, not that she would send someone, but that when the time was right, someone would come. And here I am, right when you went looking. That seems like more than just coincidence to me." Maggie thought about this, her small face serious in the dimming light. "So maybe you're not an angel, but maybe Mama knew you'd come anyway? Maybe something like that." "That's almost as good," Maggie decided. "Papa says we have to deal with what is, not what we wish for. But I think sometimes what is turns out to be what we wished for, just in a different shape than we expected." Lillian felt tears prick her eyes again, but these were different from the ones she'd shed upstairs. "You're a very wise little girl, Maggie Hale." "That's what Uncle Thomas used to say," Maggie replied, pride evident in her voice. "He said I was going to be trouble when I grew up because I thought too much. But he said it like it was a good thing, like thinking too much was better than not thinking enough." They rocked and watched until the sun disappeared completely and stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. When Maggie started to yawn, Lillian suggested it was time for bed. "Will you tell me a story?" Maggie asked as they went inside. "Mama used to tell me stories every night. Papa tries sometimes, but he's not very good at it. He always forgets the middle parts and just tells me how it ends." Caleb was still at the sink, washing dishes with more attention than the task required. He glanced up as they entered, and Lillian saw something flash across his face. Hope, maybe, or relief that his daughter had found someone to fill a need he couldn't meet. "I'd be happy to tell you a story," Lillian said. "Let's get you ready for bed first." Maggie's room was small but charming, with a narrow bed covered in a colorful quilt and shelves lined with treasures, rocks and feathers, and bits of glass that caught the light. A rag doll sat propped on the pillow, its features faded but clearly beloved. The child changed into her nightgown with the unself-conscious ease of someone used to managing on her own, then climbed into bed and patted the space beside her expectantly. Lillian sat, her mind racing through stories she knew. Not fairy tales. Those seemed wrong somehow, too full of easy magic and simple solutions. Not religious parables, which she suspected wouldn't be welcome in this house. Finally, she settled on a story her father had told her, about a girl who traveled far from home and learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. Maggie listened with rapt attention, her eyes growing heavy as Lillian's voice wove through the narrative. By the time the story ended with the girl finding her way home, not to the place she'd left, but to a new place that felt like home anyway, Maggie was nearly asleep. "Miss Lillian?" she murmured drowsily. "Will you still be here tomorrow?" "Yes," Lillian promised. "I'll be here tomorrow." "Good. That's good." And then she was asleep, her small chest rising and falling with the deep, easy breathing of childhood. Lillian sat for a moment longer, looking at this child who had so easily claimed a piece of her heart. Then she carefully tucked the quilt around Maggie's shoulders, kissed her forehead gently, and slipped from the room. Caleb was on the porch now, sitting in one of the rockers with a cup of coffee in his hands. He didn't look up as Lillian emerged, but he spoke quietly. "Thank you for the story. She hasn't settled that easy in months." Lillian took the other rocker, grateful for the darkness that hid her face. "She's a lovely child. You've done well with her, considering." "Considering I have no idea what I'm doing?" Caleb's laugh was bitter. "Yeah, some days are better than others. Some days I think she'd be better off with relatives back east, with women who know how to raise girls properly. But I can't. I can't let her go. She's all I have left." "She needs you," Lillian said firmly. "And you need her. Anyone can see that. The rest, the proper manners and the hairbrushing and all of that, those things can be learned. Love can't be taught, and that child knows she's loved." Caleb was quiet for so long Lillian thought perhaps she'd overstepped. Then he said, "My wife died in childbirth, our second child. Neither of them survived. Margaret, that was my wife, Maggie's, named for her. She was so excited about giving Maggie a sibling, said the ranch felt too quiet with just one little voice. And then she was gone, and the baby was gone, and there was just Maggie and me and this enormous silence that felt like it would swallow us both." "I'm so sorry," Lillian whispered. "Thomas helped. He moved in after Margaret died, said he wasn't leaving me alone to raise a 2-year-old while trying to keep the ranch running. He was always better with words than me, better at making Maggie smile, better at filling up the quiet spaces. And then he left with that cavalry unit, and I couldn't stop him because we needed the money and he wanted to help, and I thought..." His voice cracked. "I thought he'd come back. He was supposed to come back." The grief in his voice was overwhelming, and Lillian found herself reaching across the space between the rockers to touch his arm. He flinched at first, then stilled, as if the simple human contact was both painful and necessary. "I found his letters after," Caleb continued. "Must have been 20 of them, all sealed and addressed. Most were to friends, a few business contacts, and one to you. I saw the name, Miss Lillian Moore, Boston, Massachusetts, and I thought maybe you were a cousin or an old family friend. I never thought he'd go looking for a wife without telling me." "Why would he keep it secret?" Lillian asked. Caleb was quiet again, thinking. Pride, maybe. Or fear that I'd try to talk him out of it. Thomas knew I was barely holding things together. Maybe he thought if he could bring home a wife, someone to help with the house and Maggie, it would ease the burden. He was always trying to fix things, to make everything better, couldn't stand to see people struggling. "He sounds like he was a good man." "He was. Too good for his own welfare sometimes. The world isn't kind to good men." They sat in silence, rocking slowly, the night sounds of the ranch surrounding them, horses shifting in the corrals, an owl calling from somewhere in the darkness, the whisper of wind through grass. "What will you do?" Caleb asked eventually. "Tomorrow, I mean. I'll take you into town, help you arrange passage back east. If you're short on funds, I can loan you enough for the ticket. You can pay me back when you're settled." It was a generous offer, more than generous, considering he owed her nothing. But the thought of accepting it, of being indebted to yet another person, of crawling back to Boston with her tail between her legs, made something in Lillian rebel. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I keep trying to imagine going back, and I can't picture it. There's nothing there for me anymore. But there's nothing here either, or there wasn't supposed to be. I don't know what I'm meant to do with a future I never planned for." "That's the West for you," Caleb said with dark humor. "Full of people who came here because everywhere else stopped making sense. We're all running from something or toward something, and half the time we can't tell which. What were you running from? Or were you born here? Running to, Caleb corrected. Margaret and I came from Missouri 10 years ago. Her father didn't approve of me. I was just a ranch hand with no prospects, and she was supposed to marry the banker's son. So we took what money we had and came out here where nobody cared who we'd been before. Built this place from nothing, one fence post and one head of cattle at a time. It was hard, but it was ours, you know. We were building something that mattered. And Thomas? He followed us a few years later, couldn't make a go of it back home, and figured if we could do it, so could he. He was younger, still had that optimism that makes you think everything will work out if you just try hard enough. Caleb's voice softened. He never lost that, not even when things got hard. Even dying, he probably thought it would be all right somehow. Lillian heard the love beneath the words, the complicated tangle of grief and anger and guilt that came with surviving when someone you loved didn't. She understood it, had felt the same thing after her father's death, the irrational fury at him for leaving her alone mixed with devastating sorrow that he was gone. You should keep the room, Caleb said abruptly. Thomas's room. Not forever, but longer than one night. Until you figure out what you want to do. There's work here if you're willing. Real work, not charity. Maggie needs someone, and I'm not equipped to give her what she needs. If you stayed on for a while, just temporarily, I could pay you something. Not much, but room and board and a little besides. Then when you're ready to leave, you'd have enough saved to go wherever you wanted, do whatever you decided. No obligations, no expectations, just help, if you're willing. Lillian's heart raced. It wasn't what she'd come for. It wasn't marriage, or security, or a permanent home. But it was something, a bridge between the future she'd lost and whatever came next. And more than that, it was purpose. For the first time since stepping off that train, she felt like there might be a reason she'd come all this way. I'd need to think about it, she said carefully. It's not what either of us planned, and I wouldn't want to make promises I can't keep. Maggie's already lost too many people. Fair enough. Think on it tonight. We can talk more in the morning. They rocked in silence a while longer, then Caleb stood, stretching his back with a wince. I should check the horses before bed. You can stay out here as long as you like. The night air's good for thinking. He disappeared into the darkness, leaving Lillian alone with the stars and the impossible decision ahead of her. She stayed on the porch for another hour, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the ranch settle into sleep. In Boston, night had meant lamplight and city sounds and the constant presence of other people. Here, the darkness was absolute and the silence was profound, broken only by natural sounds that spoke of a world much older and larger than human concerns. It should have felt frightening, this vast emptiness. Instead, Lillian found it strangely comforting. Here, in this place where no one knew her past or had expectations about her future, she could be whoever she chose to be. Not someone's daughter or someone's almost bride, not a burden or a charity case, but simply herself, competent, capable, choosing her own path. When she finally went inside, the house was dark except for a lamp left burning low on the kitchen table. Lillian carried it upstairs carefully, mindful of the sleeping child and the man who had offered her more than he needed to. In Thomas Hale's room, in her room now, at least for tonight and possibly longer, she changed into her nightgown and sat on the bed with the leather journal she'd noticed earlier. She still felt it would be wrong to read it, but she opened it to the first page just to see his handwriting, to connect in some small way with the man who had brought her here. The first entry was dated 3 years earlier, just a few lines about arriving at the ranch and beginning work on expanding the barn. Ordinary observations, nothing profound. Lillian flipped to the last entry, dated a week before Thomas left with the cavalry unit. Tomorrow I leave to scout for Captain Henderson's troop. Caleb thinks I'm crazy, and maybe I am. But the ranch needs capital, and this is honest work that pays well. Besides, it's only for a few weeks. I'll be back before the spring planting, with enough money to finally buy that breeding bull we need. Margaret would have known how to talk sense into me, but Caleb's too deep in his own grief to see past it. Someone has to push forward, has to believe things can get better. If I don't, who will? Lillian closed the journal gently and placed it back on the dresser. Thomas Hale had died trying to build a better future for the people he loved. She had come here chasing a different future, one that had turned out to be a ghost. But maybe, just maybe, there was a third future waiting, one neither of them had imagined, but that might serve them all. She blew out the lamp and lay in the darkness, listening to the foreign sounds of the ranch at night, feeling the roughness of the hand-sewn quilt beneath her fingers, breathing air that tasted of dust and distance and possibility. Tomorrow she would decide. Tonight, she would simply rest. Somewhere in the house, floorboards creaked as Caleb moved through his nighttime routine. In the room next door, Maggie made small sounds in her sleep, the contented noises of a child who believed angels came when you needed them. And Lillian, who had never believed in angels or miracles or easy answers, found herself hoping that maybe, in the strangest possible way, she had been delivered to exactly where she was meant to be. She fell asleep with that thought, and for the first time in months, she didn't dream of loss or fear or the bookshop that was no longer hers. Instead, she dreamed of sunrise over hills she'd never seen before, of small hands holding hers with trust, of a man's rough voice speaking her name with something that might, someday, become gratitude. It wasn't the dream she'd planned for, but it was a dream nonetheless, fragile and new and entirely her own. Morning came with the sound of roosters and the smell of coffee brewing. Lillian woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until she saw the unfamiliar ceiling and felt the texture of the quilt beneath her hands. Thomas Hale's room. New Mexico. A life that made no sense but was somehow hers anyway. She dressed quickly in a simple gray work dress, braided her hair into a practical plait, and went downstairs to find Caleb already at the stove, frying eggs in a cast-iron skillet. He glanced up when she entered, his expression unreadable in the early light. "Coffee's hot," he said, nodding toward the pot. "Cups are in the cupboard by the window. Maggie's still asleep. She usually doesn't wake until the sun's full up." Lillian poured herself a cup and stood awkwardly by the table, unsure of the protocol. Was she a guest? An employee? Something else entirely? "Sit," Caleb said, apparently reading her uncertainty. "No point standing on ceremony. If you decide to stay, we'll all be eating together anyway. Might as well start the habit now." So she sat, wrapping her hands around the warm cup and watching as he worked with the efficient movements of someone long accustomed to managing alone. The eggs sizzled, bread toasted on the stovetop, and within minutes he'd assembled 2 plates of food that he set on the table. "You thought about my offer?" he asked, cutting straight to the heart of things as he sat down across from her. "I did." Lillian took a breath, steadying herself. "I'd like to accept, at least for a trial period. A month, maybe? That would give both of us time to see if the arrangement works. If it does, we can discuss extending it. If it doesn't, I'll have saved enough for train fare and won't feel like I'm leaving you in the lurch." Something that might have been relief crossed Caleb's face. "A month's fare. I'll pay you $5 a week plus room and board. That's more than most household help gets, but you'll be doing more than housework. Maggie needs teaching, reading, writing, numbers. She's bright, but she needs structure. And the ranch books are a mess since Margaret died. If you're as good with figures as you say, that alone would be worth keeping you on." "That's generous," Lillian said, surprised. "More than generous." "It's practical," Caleb corrected. "I need help, you need work. Fair trade, nothing more to it than that." They ate in silence for a few moments, and then Lillian asked, "What exactly would you want me to do? Beyond Maggie's lessons and the books, I mean. I should know what I'm agreeing to." Caleb considered, chewing thoughtfully. "House needs a woman's attention. Proper cleaning, mending, that sort of thing. Garden's gone to seed and could use planting if you know anything about vegetables. Maggie needs watching when I'm out working the herd, needs someone to talk to who isn't her grieving father. And I suppose you'll want to learn some ranch skills. How to handle horses, shoot a rifle, things that'll keep you safe out here." "Shoot a rifle?" Lillian repeated, uncertain if he was serious. "This isn't Boston," Caleb said flatly. "Rattlesnakes, coyotes, occasionally worse things. You need to know how to protect yourself and Maggie if I'm not around. I'll teach you the basics. You don't need to be a sharpshooter, just competent enough to hit what you're aiming at." The reality of what she was agreeing to settled over Lillian like a weight. This wasn't going to be some genteel governess position where her biggest concern was proper tea service. This was survival, plain and hard, in a place that demanded toughness she wasn't sure she possessed. "All right," she said quietly, "teach me what I need to know." Caleb nodded, apparently satisfied. "We'll start with the books today, let you get your bearings. Tomorrow I'll show you around the property proper, introduce you to the horses. Day after that, we'll work on shooting. No point rushing. You'll pick it up as you go." Footsteps on the stairs announced Maggie's arrival. She appeared in the doorway, hair tangled and nightgown twisted, her face lighting up when she saw Lillian. "You stayed!" she exclaimed, rushing over to wrap her arms around Lillian's waist. "I was afraid I'd wake up, and you'd be gone like it was just a dream." "I stayed," Lillian confirmed, smoothing the child's wild hair. "In fact, I'm going to stay for a while longer. Your father has asked me to help around the ranch and with your lessons. Would that be all right with you?" Maggie's response was to squeeze tighter, her small body trembling with what might have been relief or joy, or both. Over her head, Lillian caught Caleb watching them with an expression that made her chest ache. Longing mixed with pain, as if he wanted desperately to be the one his daughter ran to, but couldn't quite bridge the gap his grief had created. "Let Miss Lillian breathe, sweetheart," he said gently. "Go get dressed and come have breakfast. We've got a full day ahead." The morning passed in a blur of activity. After breakfast, Caleb showed Lillian to a small room off the kitchen that served as an office. The desk was buried under papers, receipts, ledgers, letters, bills, all jumbled together in a chaos that made Lillian's organized mind recoil. "Margaret handled all this," Caleb explained, looking embarrassed. "She had a system, knew where everything was. After she died, I kept throwing papers here and hoping they'd sort themselves. I know what I owe and roughly what's owed to me, but beyond that..." He trailed off helplessly. "I'll sort it out," Lillian promised, already mentally categorizing the mess. "It might take a few days, but I'll get everything organized and show you where you stand financially. There's money in the bank in town," Caleb added. "Not much, but enough to keep us going through next winter if we're careful. Thomas's scouting pay should come through eventually too, once the Army processes the paperwork. That'll help." The thought of profiting from Thomas's death felt ghoulish, but Lillian understood the practical necessity. The dead didn't need money. The living did. She spent the rest of the morning working through the papers while Maggie played quietly nearby, sorting buttons into piles by color and size. The child was indeed bright, with a natural affinity for organization that reminded Lillian of herself at that age. "Can you read, Maggie?" Lillian asked during a break. "A little. Mama was teaching me and Uncle Thomas helped sometimes. But nobody's had time since they left." There was no accusation in her voice, just a statement of fact that somehow made it worse. "Well, we'll make time now," Lillian said firmly. "Every afternoon after lunch, we'll have lessons. Reading, writing, arithmetic, maybe some geography and history too. Would you like that?" Maggie's face glowed. "Really? Real lessons like town children get?" "Better than town lessons," Lillian promised. "We'll make them interesting." Around noon, Caleb came in dusty and tired, having spent the morning repairing fence line. Lillian fixed a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and leftover stew, and they ate together in a companionship that was becoming almost comfortable. After lunch, true to her word, Lillian began Maggie's first lesson. They started with reading, using one of Thomas's books, a simplified collection of Aesop's fables that seemed appropriate. Maggie struggled at first, sounding out words slowly, but she was determined and made steady progress. "The tortoise and the hare," she read carefully. "The hare was very..." She looked up at Lillian for help. "Proud," Lillian supplied. "Proud." The hare was very proud of his speed. Maggie beamed at getting through the sentence. "I like this story. Mama told it to me once, but I didn't know it was in a book." They worked through the fable together, Maggie reading and Lillian helping with difficult words. By the end, the child was exhausted but happy, clutching the book to her chest like a treasure. "Can we read another tomorrow?" "Every day," Lillian promised. "Now go play outside for a bit while I help your father with something." Maggie skipped out, and Lillian returned to the office where Caleb was attempting to make sense of a feed bill. She worked beside him for the next several hours, explaining her organizational system and showing him how to track expenses properly. "You're good at this," he said, watching her neat columns of figures. "Better than Margaret even, and she was sharp with numbers." "My father insisted I learn bookkeeping," Lillian explained. "He said numbers don't lie, and anyone who handles money needs to respect that truth." Smart man. He was. I wish... She stopped, surprised by the sudden tightness in her throat. I wish he could have seen me now, doing something useful with what he taught me. Caleb was quiet for a moment, then said, Thomas would have liked you. He always said he wanted someone who could challenge him, keep him honest, someone with their own mind. I wish I could have met him, Lillian said softly. The real him, I mean, not just the person in letters. He was... Caleb struggled for words. He was the kind of person who made you believe things could get better. Even when everything was falling apart, he'd find something to be optimistic about. It was annoying sometimes, that relentless hope, but mostly it was necessary. I needed that, especially after Margaret, and now he's gone and I don't... He stopped, jaw working. Lillian reached over and touched his hand briefly, the same gesture she'd made on the porch the night before. You don't have to be him. You just have to be you, doing your best. That's enough. Caleb pulled his hand away, not unkindly, but as if the comfort was too much to bear. We should finish these bills before supper. They worked in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence than before, less awkward, more like two people learning to exist in the same space without filling it with unnecessary words. The days began to develop a rhythm. Mornings were for housework and ranch business, afternoons for Maggie's lessons, evenings for sitting on the porch and watching the sunset. Lillian learned where things were kept, how Caleb liked his coffee, which of Maggie's dresses needed mending. She discovered that the root cellar flooded when it rained and that the rooster was mean-tempered and would attack if you weren't careful. On the third day, Caleb took her out to meet the horses properly. There were 6 of them, 4 working horses used for herding and hauling, and 2 riding horses, one of which had belonged to Thomas. This is Copper, Caleb said, introducing her to a reddish-brown mare with gentle eyes. She was Thomas's favorite. Good-natured, steady, won't spook easy. She'd be a good mount for you if you're willing to learn to ride. Lillian had never been on a horse in her life, but she approached Copper cautiously, letting the mare sniff her hand before attempting to stroke her neck. The horse was warm and solid, and something about her calm presence was reassuring. She likes you, Caleb observed. That's a good sign. We'll start riding lessons next week once you're more settled in. He showed her the rest of the barn, explaining the daily care the horses needed and how to recognize signs of illness or injury. It was overwhelming, but Lillian took mental notes, determined to learn. That afternoon, he kept his promise about the rifle. They set up targets behind the barn, old bottles balanced on fence posts, and Caleb pulled out a weathered Winchester rifle. This was Margaret's, he said, handing it to Lillian. Lighter than mine, easier for you to handle. She was a good shot, used to hunt rabbits for the stew pot. The rifle was heavier than Lillian expected, awkward in her unpracticed hands. Caleb stood behind her, adjusting her stance, showing her how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to sight down the barrel, how to breathe and squeeze the trigger rather than jerking it. It's going to kick, he warned. Don't let it scare you, just stay steady. Lillian focused on the nearest bottle, trying to remember everything he'd told her. She squeezed the trigger and the rifle cracked loud enough to make her ears ring. The bullet went wide, hitting the fence post several feet from the target. Not bad for a first try, Caleb said. Try again. Remember to breathe. She tried 5 more times, missing every shot but getting progressively closer. Her shoulder ached from the recoil, and her ears were still ringing, but there was something satisfying about the challenge, about learning a skill so foreign to everything she'd known in Boston. We'll practice every few days, Caleb said, taking back the rifle. You're not hopeless. That's something. Most people flinch on the first shot and won't try again. It was perhaps the closest thing to a compliment he'd given her, and Lillian found herself ridiculously pleased by it. That evening, as she sat on the porch with Maggie curled against her side, Lillian felt something she hadn't felt since before her father died, a sense of purpose, of belonging somewhere, of being needed. It wasn't the life she'd planned, wasn't the security or partnership she'd imagined, but it was real and solid and hers. Miss Lillian, Maggie's sleepy voice interrupted her thoughts. Are you happy here? Lillian considered the question carefully. I think I might be, she said honestly. It's different from anything I've known, but different isn't always bad. Are you happy I'm here? So happy, Maggie murmured. Papa's different when you're around. Less quiet in the sad way, more quiet in the peaceful way. I like peaceful better. Before Lillian could respond, Caleb emerged from the house, and Maggie perked up. Papa, tell Miss Lillian about the time you and Mama saw the bear. That's not much of a story, Caleb protested, but Maggie was insistent. Please. She likes stories, and you never tell them anymore. So Caleb settled into his rocker and told a story about encountering a black bear while he and Margaret were checking fence line years ago. It wasn't elaborate or particularly dramatic, but the way he told it, with reluctant humor and obvious affection for his late wife, made it compelling. Maggie had clearly heard it before, but laughed at all the same parts, delighted to have her father engaged. When the story ended, Caleb looked almost surprised at himself, as if he'd forgotten he could still tell stories, could still remember without drowning in the remembering. The week passed, and then another. Lillian's trial month was slipping by faster than she'd expected. The ranch books were organized now, everything filed and categorized and reconciled. She'd discovered Caleb was in better financial shape than he'd thought. Not wealthy by any means, but stable, with enough saved to weather setbacks. She'd also uncovered some outstanding debts that hadn't been paid, including one to a man named Victor Drummond, who owned several properties in town. The amount was significant, nearly $200, and according to the notes Margaret had kept, it had been borrowed to purchase cattle during a hard winter 3 years ago. Drummond, Caleb said when she asked about it, his expression darkening. I've been making payments when I can, but he keeps adding interest. Says it's standard practice, but the rate seems criminal. Does he have documentation of the interest terms? Lillian asked. Just his word against mine. Margaret handled the original loan, and she's not here to confirm what was agreed. The bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to cut. Lillian made a note to look into it further. Something about the situation felt wrong, but she'd need more information before she could say why. Meanwhile, Maggie was flourishing under regular lessons. She'd finished the Aesop's Fables and moved on to a simple geography primer, fascinated by maps and the idea that there were places vastly different from her own small world. She asked endless questions. What was an ocean like? Did people really live in cities with buildings as tall as trees? Were there truly countries where everyone spoke different languages? Lillian answered what she could and admitted ignorance when she couldn't, which Maggie seemed to appreciate. Mama used to pretend she knew everything, the child confided, but I think it's braver to say when you don't know something. The shooting lessons continued as well. Lillian still couldn't hit a bottle reliably, but she could hit the fence post most times, and Caleb seemed satisfied with her progress. You'll never be a marksman, he said bluntly after one session, but you're competent enough to scare off a coyote or signal for help if you need to. That's what matters. On the 15th day, Lillian woke to the sound of horses approaching the house. She dressed quickly and hurried downstairs to find Caleb already outside, his body language tense. Through the window, she could see 3 riders, well-dressed men on expensive horses, clearly not ranch hands or passing travelers. The man in the lead was perhaps 50, with silver-threaded hair and an air of authority that suggested he was used to getting his way. He dismounted with the ease of someone who'd spent considerable time on horseback, and his smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Caleb Hale," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the morning air. "It's been a while. I'd begun to think you were avoiding me." "Drummond." Caleb's voice was flat, unwelcoming. "What brings you out here?" "Business, naturally. I believe we have a matter of some outstanding debt to discuss." Lillian's stomach tightened. The man from the ledgers, the one who'd loaned Caleb money and kept adding interest. She moved closer to the window, watching carefully. "I've been making payments," Caleb said. "Regular payments, same as always." "Indeed you have, and I appreciate your diligence. However, circumstances have changed. I'm consolidating my investments, and I'm afraid I need to call in my loans, all of them, immediately." The silence that followed was terrible. Lillian could see Caleb's hands clench into fists at his sides, could read the shock and anger in every line of his body. "That wasn't the agreement," he said finally, his voice dangerously quiet. "The agreement was that I could call in the loan at any time with 30 days' notice. I'm giving you that notice now, $200 plus accumulated interest. Let's call it $240 total. Due in full by, Drummond made a show of calculating, May 20th. That gives you more than 30 days, actually. I'm being generous. That's impossible. You know I don't have that kind of cash on hand. Then I suggest you find it. Sell some cattle, perhaps, or mortgage the property. I'm sure someone in town would be willing to help you out. Drummond's smile widened. Or, of course, if you can't pay, I'd be willing to accept the property itself as settlement. Take the whole debt burden off your shoulders. Understanding crashed over Lillian like cold water. This wasn't about debt collection. This was about land acquisition. Drummond wanted the ranch, and he was using the loan as leverage to force Caleb into a corner. You'll get your money, Caleb said, his voice like iron. All of it, on time. Now get off my property. Drummond's smile never wavered. 30 days, Hale. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. He remounted his horse, his companions doing the same. Oh, and I heard about your brother. Tragic, truly. Seems like your family has had more than its share of misfortune lately. Would be a shame if more bad luck came your way. The threat was clear, and Lillian saw Caleb's hands shake with suppressed rage. But he said nothing, just stood rigid until the three riders had disappeared down the road. Only then did he move, turning to slam his fist into the porch railing hard enough to split the wood. The violence of it made Lillian flinch, but she understood. He needed an outlet for the fury and fear that had nowhere else to go. She stepped outside quietly. Caleb? He spun around, and for a moment she saw raw anguish in his face before he locked it away. You heard? Most of it. Is what he said true? About calling in the loan? Probably. Margaret would have read the contract carefully, but knowing Drummond, he made sure there was an escape clause that favored him. Caleb rubbed his face with both hands. $240. I've got maybe 60 in the bank, and I can't sell cattle now. They're not ready for market and won't be for months. Even if I could, I wouldn't get fair price selling in desperation. There has to be another way, Lillian said. Let me look at the books again, see if there's something we're missing. Maybe there's nothing to miss. The words came out harsher than he probably intended. Don't you think I've been over it 1,000 times? This ranch barely makes enough to keep us fed and sheltered. There's no hidden treasure, no miracle solution. Drummond knows that. He's been waiting for the right moment to corner me, and now he's got it. Maggie appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. Papa, why are you yelling? Caleb's expression crumbled. He crossed to his daughter, knelt down, and pulled her into a fierce hug. I'm sorry, sweetheart. Just some grown-up problems? Nothing for you to worry about. But Maggie wasn't fooled. Are we going to lose the ranch? Like Jenny's family lost theirs last year? No, Caleb said firmly, though Lillian heard the desperation beneath the certainty. No, we're not going to lose anything. I promise. It was a promise he couldn't necessarily keep, and they all knew it. But sometimes promises were all you had to hold on to, even when the ground beneath you was crumbling. Lillian spent the rest of the day poring over the books, looking for any solution, any angle Drummond might have left exposed. But Caleb was right. There was nothing. The ranch was solvent, but cash poor, and raising $240 in 30 days seemed impossible. That evening, as she prepared supper, an idea began to form. It was risky, possibly foolish, but it might be their only option. She waited until after Maggie was in bed to broach it. What if I went to town? She said. Talked to Drummond myself? Tried to negotiate an extension or a payment plan? Caleb looked at her like she'd suggested flying to the moon. Why would he listen to you? Because I'm not you. I'm a woman, an outsider, someone he doesn't see as a threat. Sometimes people reveal things to someone they underestimate that they'd never tell someone they consider an adversary. It's too dangerous, Caleb said immediately. Drummond's not someone to trifle with. And what's the alternative? Sit here and hope for a miracle? They stared at each other across the kitchen table, both stubborn, both desperate in different ways. Finally, Caleb looked away. Even if you went, even if you got him to talk, what good would it do? Information is power, Lillian said firmly. Right now he has all the cards because we don't know what he's really after or what he's willing to accept. If I can learn more about his situation, his plans, maybe we can find leverage. It's worth trying. Caleb was silent for a long time. Then he said, If you're determined to do this, I'm coming with you. That defeats the purpose. He'll be on guard if you're there. I don't care. You're not going alone. There was finality in his voice that Lillian recognized. She could push, but she'd lose. Fine, we'll both go. Tomorrow. They rode into town in the morning, leaving Maggie with Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house. The woman had been delighted to hear Lillian was staying on at the ranch, and she agreed to watch the child without question. Drummond's office was on the main street, above the general store. The sign read, Drummond Land and Cattle Company, which Lillian found grimly appropriate. Inside, a clerk directed them to wait. They sat in uncomfortable chairs, and Lillian used the time to study the office. Maps on the walls showed property lines, with certain parcels marked in red. She noticed that Caleb's ranch was among them, along with several other small holdings in the area. He's buying up land, she whispered to Caleb. Look at the maps. Before Caleb could respond, Drummond emerged from the inner office, his expression shifting from welcoming to guarded when he saw who his visitors were. Mr. Hale. And you must be Lillian Moore, she said, rising to offer her hand. I'm assisting Mr. Hale with his business affairs. Drummond's handshake was perfunctory. I see. Well, if you're here to discuss the loan situation, I'm afraid there's nothing to discuss. The terms are clear. I'm here to better understand those terms, Lillian said calmly, and to see if there might be room for negotiation. There isn't. Mr. Drummond, surely as a businessman, you understand that rigid positions benefit no one. Mr. Hale has been a reliable debtor for 3 years. Calling in the loan now during a season when cash flow is necessarily limited seems counterproductive. Wouldn't a reasonable payment plan serve your interests better than forcing a sale that might not recover the full amount? Something flickered in Drummond's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that this Eastern woman was speaking his language. Miss Moore, I appreciate your initiative, but my decision stands. If Mr. Hale cannot pay, he should sell to someone who can make better use of the land. That's simply good business. And if he could pay, but in installments, say $80 immediately with the remainder over the next 6 months? Where would he get $80 immediately? Drummond's skepticism was obvious. Lillian didn't have an answer to that, not really, but she held his gaze steadily. That's his concern, not yours. The question is whether you'd accept such an arrangement. Drummond studied her for a long moment, then smiled. That same cold smile from the ranch. No, Miss Moore, I would not. The loan is due in full on May 20th. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other appointments. They were dismissed, and there was nothing to do but leave. Outside, Caleb exhaled sharply. That was a waste of time. Not entirely, Lillian said slowly. Did you see the maps? He's targeting specific properties, all in the same area. This isn't just about your debt. He's planning something larger. If we can figure out what, maybe we can find a way to stop him. And how do we do that with no money and no time? Lillian didn't have an answer, but as they rode back to the ranch, an idea began to form. Dangerous, probably stupid, but possibly their only chance. That night, after Maggie was asleep, she told Caleb her plan. Absolutely not, he said immediately. It's the only way. It's insane. It might work. They argued in fierce whispers until finally, exhausted, Caleb agreed. Not because he thought it was a good idea, but because neither of them could think of anything better. And so, 2 days later, Lillian found herself preparing for the most audacious gamble of her life, with everything, the ranch, Maggie's home, the fragile new life she was building, hanging in the balance. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. Lillian would return to town alone, ostensibly to purchase supplies, but her real purpose was to visit every business owner, every rancher, every person who might have dealings with Victor Drummond. She would ask questions, listen carefully, and piece together what the man was really planning. Information, she'd told Caleb, was their only weapon when they had no money and no time. Caleb had hated the idea, but desperation made allies of unlikely strategies. She left early on a Tuesday morning, wearing her most respectable dress and carrying a list of legitimate supplies to purchase. Maggie had clung to her before she left, extracting a promise that Lillian would be back before dark. I don't like when people leave, the child had whispered against Lillian's shoulder. I'm coming back, Lillian had promised, holding her tight. I swear it. The ride to town took nearly an hour, and Lillian used the time to rehearse her approach. She couldn't be too direct, or people would become suspicious. She needed to seem casual, merely curious, a newcomer trying to understand the local landscape. Her first stop was the general store, where a kindly woman named Mrs. Patterson ran the counter. Lillian made her purchases slowly, engaging in the sort of small talk that seemed natural. "I'm still learning about the area," she said as Mrs. Patterson wrapped her sugar and flour. "Mr. Hale mentioned that land changes hands fairly often out here. Is that true?" "Oh, more than it used to," Mrs. Patterson said, warming to the gossip. "Used to be folks held onto their places through thick and thin, but these past few years seems like someone's always selling out. Hard times, you know. Cattle prices down, water scarce. Takes money to survive a bad season, and not everyone's got it saved up." "I noticed Mr. Drummond seems to own quite a bit of property," Lillian ventured. Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "That he does? Smart businessman, some say. Others say he's a vulture, picking at bones before the body's even cold." She caught herself, looking embarrassed. "Not that I'm one to spread tales, you understand." "Of course not," Lillian said smoothly. "I'm just trying to understand how things work here. It's all so different from Boston." "Well, if you want my advice, stay clear of Drummond's business. He's got plans, that one, and they don't tend to favor the little folk like us." Mrs. Patterson leaned in conspiratorially. "I've heard he's been talking to railroad men, something about a new spur line coming through, though nobody knows for sure where it'll run. If you're smart enough to buy land in the right spot before the railroad announces their route—" She trailed off meaningfully. Railroad. The word clicked something into place in Lillian's mind. If Drummond was accumulating land along a future railroad route, those properties would increase in value exponentially. That's why he wanted Caleb's ranch. Not for the land itself, but for what it would be worth once the railroad came through. She thanked Mrs. Patterson and moved on to the bank, where she made a small deposit from the household money Caleb had given her. The banker, Mr. Weathers, was less talkative, but confirmed what Mrs. Patterson had suggested. "Drummond's been buying up properties along the northern corridor," he said, studying a map on his wall. "If the railroad does come through there, he'll make a fortune. Of course, if it goes south instead, he'll have wasted considerable capital. It's a gamble, but then again, Drummond's always been a gambling man." "Does he force people to sell?" Lillian asked, trying to sound merely curious rather than desperately interested. Weathers shifted uncomfortably. "I wouldn't say force exactly, but he has ways of encouraging decisions. Outstanding loans called in unexpectedly, property taxes that suddenly come due, cattle that mysteriously sicken just before sale time. Nothing you could prove in court, mind you, just unfortunate coincidences that tend to happen to people who stand in his way." The picture was becoming clearer and more disturbing. Drummond wasn't just a shrewd businessman. He was willing to use any method necessary to acquire what he wanted. And right now, he wanted Caleb's ranch. Lillian spent the rest of the morning gathering information from various sources. The blacksmith told her about a rancher who'd lost his herd to poisoned water, though no one could prove the creek had been deliberately contaminated. The seamstress mentioned a family whose barn had burned down under suspicious circumstances. Each story painted the same picture. Drummond wanted land, and obstacles had a way of disappearing. By noon, Lillian's carefully maintained composure was beginning to crack. The scope of what they were up against felt overwhelming. This wasn't just about paying a debt. It was about standing up to a man who had power, connections, and no apparent scruples about how he used them. She was heading back to retrieve her horse when she overheard two men talking outside the saloon. One of them mentioned Drummond's name, and Lillian slowed her pace, pretending to adjust her packages while she listened. "He's got those men coming out from Denver next week," one man said. "The ones he uses when persuasion ain't enough." "What's he need them for? Thought the Hale place was already wrapped up." "It should be, but apparently Hale's got some Eastern woman helping him now. Word is she's smart, asking questions all over town. Drummond don't like complications." "What's he planning?" "Don't know specifics, but I heard him tell those men to make sure Hale understands his situation. Sometimes a man needs to see what he's got to lose before he appreciates an opportunity to walk away clean." The implication was chilling. Lillian hurried to her horse, her heart pounding. She needed to get back to the ranch. needed to warn Caleb that Drummond's patience was running out and his methods were about to become more direct. She pushed Copper harder than she should have on the ride back, arriving at the ranch in late afternoon rather than evening. Caleb was working near the barn and looked up in surprise when he heard her approach. "You're early. What happened?" Lillian dismounted quickly, words tumbling out as she recounted everything she'd learned. Caleb's expression grew darker with each revelation, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "Men from Denver," he repeated when she finished. "That's what you heard?" "Yes, they're coming next week, and the implication was that they're not coming for polite conversation." Caleb swore viciously, then caught himself, glancing toward the house where Maggie was presumably playing. "This is worse than I thought. Drummond's not just trying to pressure me, he's planning something. An accident, maybe, or some disaster that would force me to sell immediately." "We need to go to the sheriff," Lillian said. "And tell him what? That I overheard some men talking? That Drummond's collecting properties and I think he's up to no good? There's no proof, nothing concrete. The sheriff would laugh me out of his office, assuming he's not already in Drummond's pocket." "Then what do we do?" Before Caleb could answer, Maggie came running from the house, her face bright with excitement. "Papa, Miss Lillian, come quick. There's a man here to see you." Lillian and Caleb exchanged worried glances. "What man, sweetheart?" Caleb asked, already moving toward the house. "He says his name is Mr. Chen. He came in a wagon with lots of supplies. He seems nice. He gave me a peppermint stick." They rounded the corner of the house to find a wagon, indeed parked in the yard, loaded with crates and barrels. Beside it stood an elderly Chinese man in practical work clothes, his weathered face creasing into a smile when he saw them. "Mr. Hale," he said, his English accented but clear. "I am Chen Wei. I have traveled from Sacramento with supplies for Thomas Hale. Your brother, I believe?" Caleb stared at him in confusion. "Thomas is dead. He died months ago." Chen's smile faded to sadness. "I feared this might be so when my letters went unanswered. I am very sorry for your loss. Thomas was a good man, honest in his dealings. We had an arrangement. I was to bring specialized supplies for his ranch expansion, paid for in advance. Since he has passed, I will return the money to you, of course." "Money?" Caleb repeated blankly. Chen climbed into his wagon and produced a lockbox, from which he withdrew a thick envelope. $120. This was the deposit Thomas sent me in January for supplies he ordered. Equipment for irrigating land, specialized seed, some tools. When he did not respond to confirm delivery, I made inquiries and learned of his death. It has taken me time to arrange my business affairs and make the journey here to return his money." Lillian's mind was racing. $120. Added to the $60 Caleb had in the bank, that was $180, still short of what they needed, but significantly closer. "I don't understand," Caleb said slowly. "Thomas sent you this money?" "In January, yes. He wrote to me of his plans, how he wished to expand the ranch, to make it prosperous. He was very hopeful, very determined. I am sorry his dreams did not come to pass." Chen held out the envelope. "This belongs to you now." Caleb took it with shaking hands, staring at the money as if it might disappear. This is more than I hoped for. Thank you, Mr. Chen. Thank you for your honesty." Chen bowed slightly. "It is only right. Your brother trusted me, and I will honor that trust even in his death. There is one other thing." He returned to the wagon and retrieved a smaller package, wrapped in oiled cloth. "Thomas also sent me a letter asking that if anything should happen to him, I should deliver this to his family. He was a cautious man, perhaps sensing danger. I think he wanted you to have this." He handed the package to Caleb, who unwrapped it carefully to reveal Thomas's journal. Not the one Lillian had seen in his room, but a different one, smaller and older. A letter was tucked inside the front cover. "I will leave you to your privacy," Chen said tactfully. "I must return to town before dark. But if you ever need supplies, honest supplies at fair prices, you contact Chen Wei in Sacramento. I would be honored to serve Thomas's family." He climbed back into his wagon and drove away, leaving them standing in the yard with the money and the journal and 1,000 questions. Caleb opened the letter with careful fingers. Lillian watched his face as he read. seeing emotions flicker across his features. Surprise, grief, something that might have been pride. "What does it say?" she asked softly. Caleb cleared his throat and read aloud. "Caleb, if you're reading this, then I didn't make it back from the cavalry run. I'm sorry for that. I know how much you've already lost, and I hate adding to it, but I want you to know I don't regret going. The money from scouting, combined with what I'd saved and the payment I sent to Chen, would have been enough to expand the ranch properly. I wanted to give you and Maggie that gift, wanted to make sure you'd be secure even if I wasn't around to help anymore. I've written to a woman in Boston, Miss Lillian Moore. She's educated, practical, and looking for a fresh start. I think she'd be a good match for me, but more importantly, I think she'd be good for you and Maggie too. You need help, brother, even if you're too proud to admit it. You need someone who can share the burden, who can bring some life back into that house. If she comes after I'm gone, give her a chance. Don't be too stubborn to accept help when it's offered." There's also information in this journal about Drummond. I've been keeping notes on his land acquisitions, his methods, everything I could learn. He approached me once, wanted me to convince you to sell. When I refused, he made threats. I documented everything. If he causes trouble after I'm gone, use this. It might not hold up in court, but it could be leverage. Take care of Maggie. Tell her Uncle Thomas loved her more than words can say. And try to forgive yourself for whatever you're blaming yourself for. Margaret wouldn't want you living in grief forever, neither do I. Be happy, Caleb. That's what we both wanted for you. Your brother Thomas. The silence after Caleb finished reading was profound. Lillian felt tears on her cheeks and didn't bother to wipe them away. Thomas had known. He'd known he might not come back, and he'd tried to protect his family even in death. He'd sent her here, not just for himself, but for them. He planned all of it, Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. The supplies, the money, bringing you here. He was trying to save us even while he was dying. He loved you very much, Lillian said quietly. Both of you. Caleb nodded, unable to speak. He opened the journal with trembling hands, and they read through it together as the sun sank lower. Thomas had been meticulous in his documentation. Dates, names, conversations, all recorded in neat handwriting. There were accounts of threats, suspicious incidents, connections between Drummond and various officials. It wasn't proof that would stand up in a court of law, but it was damning nonetheless. This is what we needed, Lillian said, excitement building despite the circumstances. This is leverage. If Drummond knows we have this, knows we could make it public, he'd deny everything, Caleb said. His word against a dead man's. But what if we didn't need it to hold up in court? What if we just needed it to make him back down? If enough people in town read this, saw the pattern, even if they couldn't prove anything legally, it would damage his reputation, make it harder for him to operate. Caleb considered this, hope and doubt warring in his expression. It's risky. If we threaten him, and it doesn't work, we've lost our only card. But we don't threaten him directly, Lillian said, thinking rapidly. We let him know we have information, let him wonder what we might do with it. Men like Drummond, they're used to controlling situations. Uncertainty makes them uncomfortable. We use that. They were still discussing strategy when the first smell of smoke reached them. Lillian noticed it first, a faint, acrid scent on the evening breeze. She lifted her head, sniffing, and saw Caleb do the same. Their eyes met in sudden alarm. The barn, Caleb said, and ran. Lillian ran too, her skirts hiked up, heart pounding. They rounded the corner to see smoke seeping from under the barn door, thin tendrils that promised worse within. The horses were screaming, terrified by the smell of fire. Get Maggie, Caleb shouted. Get her away from the house, toward the creek. But Lillian was already moving toward the barn. The horses. I'll get the horses. You get my daughter to safety. Lillian wanted to argue, wanted to help, but she knew he was right. Maggie was the priority. She sprinted toward the house, calling for the child. Maggie emerged from the kitchen, confused. Miss Lillian, what's wrong? Fire in the barn, sweetheart. We need to go to the creek right now. Lillian grabbed the child's hand and ran, not looking back until they'd reached the relative safety of the creek bed 100 yards from the buildings. Stay here, Lillian commanded. Don't move, no matter what. Promise me. But Papa, your father knows what he's doing. I need to help him. Promise me you'll stay. Maggie nodded, tears streaming down her face, and Lillian ran back toward the barn. The smoke was thicker now, black and choking. Caleb had gotten the barn door open and was leading the horses out one by one, speaking to them in a steady voice despite the danger. Lillian grabbed the halter of the nearest panicked horse and pulled it toward the corral, then ran back for another. They worked frantically, and by some miracle, got all 6 horses out before the flames spread too far. Caleb grabbed buckets, and they formed a desperate line from the water trough, throwing water on the fire with hopeless determination. It was no use. The barn was old and dry, and whatever had started the fire had done its work well. Within 20 minutes, the structure was fully engulfed, flames leaping into the darkening sky like angry spirits. "Let it go," Lillian finally said, putting a hand on Caleb's arm. "Let it burn. The horses are safe. That's what matters." Caleb dropped his bucket, defeat written in every line of his body. They stood together, watching years of work and irreplaceable equipment disappear into smoke and ash. "Drummond," Caleb said, the name a curse. "This is his answer. This is what he does when people don't cooperate." "We don't know for sure. We know." Caleb turned to her, his face smudged with soot and set with cold fury. "The timing, the method, everything. This is a message. Pay up or worse things happen. Next time maybe it's the house. Or maybe someone gets hurt." He looked toward the creek where Maggie was hiding. "I can't risk her. I won't." "So what do we do?" Before Caleb could answer, they heard the sound of approaching horses. Multiple riders coming fast. Lillian's hand went instinctively to her side, wishing she had Margaret's rifle, but it was in the house. The riders emerged from the dimness, 6 men from town, led by the blacksmith. They pulled up short, taking in the burning barn and the soot-covered pair standing before it. "We saw the smoke from town," the blacksmith said. "Came as fast as we could. Everyone all right?" "We're fine," Caleb said tightly. "Horses are safe. Just the barn and everything in it." "How'd it start?" one of the other men asked. "Don't know yet," Caleb lied, but the blacksmith's eyes were sharp. "This the same kind of fire that took the Sullivan barn last year?" the blacksmith asked pointedly. "The one that started just after Sullivan refused to sell to Drummond?" The other men shifted uncomfortably, and Lillian realized they all knew exactly what had happened here, even if no one would say it aloud. "We'll stay the night," the blacksmith announced. "Take turns keeping watch. Make sure the fire don't spread to the house or any other buildings. That all right with you, Hale?" The relief on Caleb's face was palpable. "More than all right. Thank you." The men organized themselves efficiently, some containing the fire, others taking up positions around the property. The blacksmith pulled Caleb aside, and Lillian watched them talk in low, urgent voices. When they returned, the blacksmith's expression was grim. "Hale told me about Drummond's ultimatum, about the loan and the deadline," he said to Lillian. "Some of us have been watching Drummond work for years now, watching good people lose everything while he gets richer. We're tired of it. We may not have much, but we could pull together maybe $30–40 among us. Would that help?" Lillian's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. "That would help enormously. Along with what we already have, it would be very close to what we need." "Then we'll do it," the blacksmith said firmly. "Drummond thinks he can do whatever he wants because nobody stands up to him. Maybe it's time that changed." They spent the night keeping vigil, taking turns sleeping and watching. Lillian brought out what food she had, and the men ate gratefully around a small fire well away from the still smoldering barn. Maggie had been coaxed from the creek and sat pressed against Lillian's side, silent and shaken. "It's going to be all right," Lillian whispered to her, praying it was true. "Will they come back?" Maggie asked. "The bad men who did this?" "Not tonight. Not with all these people here." "But what about tomorrow?" Lillian had no answer to that. She'd just held the child closer and watched the barn collapse in on itself in a shower of sparks and embers. By morning, the barn was nothing but a smoking ruin. The men from town prepared to leave, but the blacksmith lingered. "You need to report this to the sheriff," he said. "Even if he won't do anything, there should be a record." "What good will that do?" Caleb asked bitterly. "Maybe none. But maybe if enough incidents get reported, eventually someone has to pay attention. And if you're going to confront Drummond, you want documentation that there's been trouble here. Makes your position stronger." It was sound advice, and later that morning, Caleb and Lillian rode into town together, leaving Maggie with Mrs. Henderson again. The sheriff's office was a small building near the saloon, and the man himself was a grizzled veteran with shrewd eyes that had seen too much. Sheriff Morrison listened to their report without comment, making notes in a ledger. When Caleb finished, Morrison leaned back in his chair. "You got proof it was arson?" "The horses were locked in," Caleb said. "I never lock them in at night. They have free run of the corral. Someone had to shut that door from the outside. And there's the timing, right after I refused Drummond's terms. Timing ain't proof. Neither is a closed door. Could be one of you closed it and forgot." "I didn't forget," Caleb said, his voice hard. Morrison sighed. "I believe you, Hale, but belief ain't evidence. Drummond's got lawyers who'll tie any accusation up in knots. Unless you got witnesses who saw someone set that fire, there's not much I can do." "So he just gets away with it?" Lillian demanded. "He destroys someone's property, threatens their livelihood, and there's no consequence?" "I didn't say that." Morrison opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder. "I've been collecting reports on Drummond for 3 years now. Suspicious incidents, coincidental misfortunes, all the things that seem to happen to people who stand in his way. Individually, they don't prove anything, but taken together, they paint a picture. Problem is, I need something concrete to move on, something undeniable." "What if we had documentation?" Lillian asked. "Notes, dates, accounts of threats and intimidation?" Morrison's eyes sharpened. "What kind of documentation?" Lillian glanced at Caleb, who nodded. She explained about Thomas's journal, about the careful records he'd kept. Morrison listened with growing interest. "Bring it to me," he said when she finished. "Let me see what he had. If it's as detailed as you say, combined with what I've already got, it might be enough to at least bring Drummond in for questioning. Shake him up a bit, make him think twice before his next move." It wasn't much, but it was something. They agreed to bring the journal the next day, then stopped by the bank to make a deposit. The money from Chen and the contributions from the townspeople. Mr. Weathers counted it carefully. $208, he announced. "You're still short, but not by much." "How much time do we have?" Lillian asked. "Deadline's in 12 days. If you can come up with the remaining $32 by then, you're clear." 12 days. It seemed impossible and yet tantalizingly close. Lillian's mind raced through possibilities. They could sell something, maybe, though what they had left of value she couldn't imagine. She could wire her aunt, beg for help despite the humiliation, or... "The cattle," Caleb said suddenly. "They're not ready for market, but there's a buyer who comes through from Santa Fe sometimes, looking for young stock to drive back to his ranch. Pays less than market rate, but pays cash. If I could find him, convince him to take maybe 10 head. "Would that be enough?" Lillian asked. "Should be. Maybe more than enough if I negotiate well." It was a solution, risky but possible. They left the bank with renewed hope, fragile as it was. But that night, as Lillian lay in bed unable to sleep, she heard sounds outside. Careful, quiet sounds that didn't belong. She rose and looked out the window to see a figure near the remains of the barn, moving in the darkness. She grabbed Margaret's rifle from where Caleb had insisted she keep it and crept downstairs. Caleb was already there, his own rifle in hand, his expression murderous. "Stay inside with Maggie," he whispered. "I'm not letting you go out there alone." They argued in terse whispers until a voice from outside called out, "Hale! I know you're in there. Come out and talk like a reasonable man." Drummond. The arrogance of it took Lillian's breath away. To burn their barn and then show up in the middle of the night to demand conversation. Caleb opened the door, rifle held ready. "Get off my property." Drummond stood in the yard, flanked by 2 large men Lillian didn't recognize. The hired muscle from Denver, she realized. This was the threat made real. "I'm here to offer you one final opportunity," Drummond said, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "Sell me the ranch now, and I'll pay you fair market value, plus enough to settle your debt and relocate your family comfortably. Refuse, and things will continue to get worse. Accidents happen on ranches, Hale. People get hurt, children especially. They're so curious, so prone to wandering into dangerous situations." The threat against Maggie was explicit, and Lillian saw Caleb's hands tighten on his rifle. She stepped forward before he could do something that would end with bloodshed. "Mr. Drummond," she said, her voice calm despite her racing heart, "before you make any more threats, You should know we have documentation. Thomas Hale kept detailed records of your activities, dates, names, methods. We've already shared this information with Sheriff Morrison. If anything happens to this family, if any more accidents occur, that documentation will be made public. Every newspaper in the territory will know exactly how you've built your empire. Drummond's smile faltered for just a moment. Documentation from a dead man? That's not evidence. Perhaps not in court, Lillian agreed, but in the court of public opinion? When people see the pattern, see how every obstacle to your plans conveniently disappeared, when your business partners and potential investors read about your methods, I think you'll find it very much matters. The two men flanking Drummond shifted uneasily, and Lillian pressed her advantage. We're also short only $32 of paying your debt in full. That's hardly worth risking your reputation over. Take your money when it's due, and we all move forward. Or continue with these threats and tactics, and watch everything you've built crumble when the truth comes out. It was a bluff, partially. They didn't know if Sheriff Morrison would actually help, didn't know if the documentation would be as damaging as Lillian claimed. But Drummond didn't know that either, and uncertainty was a powerful weapon against men accustomed to control. 12 days, Drummond said finally, his voice tight. You have 12 days to pay in full. If you're $1 short, 1 hour late, the property becomes mine. And Miss Moore? I don't appreciate being threatened. Neither do we, Lillian replied evenly. Drummond and his men rode away, and only then did Lillian allow herself to shake. Caleb caught her as her legs gave out, his arms strong around her. That was the bravest, most foolish thing I've ever seen, he said, his voice rough with emotion. We have to survive the next 12 days, Lillian whispered. We have to find that money and end this. We will, Caleb said. And for the first time since she'd met him, she heard absolute certainty in his voice. We'll find it, and we'll pay him. And then we'll figure out how to expose what he's been doing. Thomas gave us the tools. We just have to use them. They stood together in the darkness, holding each other up, while inside the house Maggie slept on, innocent and unaware of how close danger had come. 12 days. Everything depended on 12 days and $32 and whether they could hold on long enough to see the dawn. The next morning came too quickly, bringing with it the weight of 12 days that felt more like 12 hours. Caleb left at dawn to search for the cattle buyer from Santa Fe, leaving Lillian and Maggie alone at the ranch with strict instructions to stay inside and keep the rifle close. Lillian spent the morning teaching Maggie her letters, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy while her mind churned through their options. $32. Such a small amount in the grand scheme of things, yet it might as well have been a fortune for how difficult it was proving to obtain. Around midday, Mrs. Henderson arrived in her wagon, accompanied by 3 other women from town. They brought food, fabric, and determined expressions that suggested they'd come for more than a social call. We heard about the barn, Mrs. Henderson said without preamble as Lillian invited them inside. And we heard about Drummond's visit last night. News travels fast in a small town, especially when someone's foolish enough to threaten a family in the middle of the night where neighbors might hear. We didn't have neighbors close enough to hear, Lillian said, confused. You did last night. The blacksmith left 2 of his boys camped in your north pasture just in case. They heard everything and came straight to town this morning. Mrs. Henderson set down her basket firmly. We've decided we're not standing by anymore. Women in this territory have less power than men in most matters, but we have our ways, and we're using them now. The other women nodded in agreement, and one of them, a younger woman Lillian recognized from the general store, stepped forward. My name is Sarah Wilkins. My husband worked for Drummond until last year when he had an accident at one of Drummond's properties. Broke his back, can't work anymore. Drummond paid nothing, said it was my husband's own carelessness. We've been surviving on charity ever since. Her voice was steady, but her eyes blazed with suppressed fury. I've been waiting for someone to stand up to that man. Looks like you're doing it. We're trying, Lillian said quietly, but we're still short of what we need. We know. That's why we're here. Mrs. Henderson opened her basket and pulled out a small leather pouch. There's $18 in here. It's not the full amount you need, but it's what we could gather this morning. Every woman who's been wronged by Drummond or knows someone who has, we pooled what we could spare. Lillian's throat tightened with emotion. I can't take your money. You need it yourselves. We need Drummond stopped more, Sarah interrupted. If you win this fight, it shows everyone else it's possible to stand up to him. That's worth more than money to us. That's worth everything. The other women murmured agreement, pressing forward with additional offerings. One brought preserves and smoked meat, explaining that Lillian could sell them at the general store for cash. Another offered her late mother's cameo brooch, insisting it would fetch a good price. The generosity overwhelmed Lillian, and she found herself accepting their gifts with tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you all. Don't thank us yet, Mrs. Henderson said practically. You've still got to survive the next 12 days and make that payment. Drummond's not going to sit idle while you gather resources. He'll be planning something. She was right, of course. That night, after the women had left and Maggie was asleep, Lillian sat at the kitchen table counting and recounting their funds. With the women's contribution, and if they could sell the items they'd offered, they'd have perhaps $26 of the remaining $32. So close, yet still impossibly far. Caleb returned near midnight, exhausted and discouraged. The cattle buyer had already passed through the territory weeks ago and wouldn't return until late summer. He'd tried to find other buyers, but no one wanted to purchase cattle before they were ready for market, not at any price that would help. We're not going to make it, he said, slumping into a chair. Even with what the women brought, we're still short, and I don't know where else to look. There has to be something, Lillian insisted. Some asset we haven't considered, some option we're overlooking. They reviewed their possessions with brutal honesty. The horses were worth money, but they needed them for the ranch to function. The remaining equipment was mostly ruined in the barn fire. The house itself had value, but they couldn't sell it without losing everything they were fighting for. There was the land, of course, but that's exactly what Drummond wanted. They'd be handing him victory. What about Thomas's personal effects? Lillian asked suddenly. Did he have anything of value? Jewelry? A watch? Anything we could sell? Caleb's expression turned pained. I couldn't. Those things are all I have left of him. I understand, but no. The word was final. I won't profit from my brother's death any more than I already have. That's where I draw the line. Lillian didn't argue, recognizing the grief beneath his stubbornness. They sat in heavy silence until Caleb finally stood. I'm going to check the perimeter once more, make sure everything's secure. You should get some sleep. But sleep felt impossible. After Caleb went outside, Lillian found herself climbing the stairs to Thomas's room. Her room now, though it still felt like his. She sat on the bed and looked around at his belongings, searching for answers in the possessions of a dead man who'd tried so hard to save them. Her eyes fell on the bookshelf, and she remembered the leather journal. They'd given it to Sheriff Morrison as promised, but there had been 2 journals. The first one, the everyday record Thomas had kept, was still here. She pulled it from the shelf and began reading through it carefully, looking for anything they might have missed. Most of it was mundane, notes about cattle, weather observations, reminders to himself about repairs needed. But tucked into the back pages, she found a folded piece of paper she hadn't noticed before. It was a claim form, official-looking, dated from 2 years ago. Thomas had filed a mining claim on a section of Caleb's property, a rocky outcropping near the northern boundary that was too steep and barren for grazing. According to the notes, he'd found traces of silver ore and filed the claim as an investment in the ranch's future. But there was no indication he'd ever developed it or told Caleb about it. Lillian's hands trembled as she read the document. A mining claim wasn't wealth itself, but it was an asset. It could be sold, transferred, or used as collateral. In the right hands, it might be worth exactly what they needed. She ran downstairs and out to the barn, or what remained of it, where Caleb was checking on the horses in the temporary corral they'd constructed. Caleb, look at this! She thrust the paper at him, breathless with excitement. He read it by lamplight, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something that might have been hope. Silver? He said. Thomas found silver on our property? According to this, he filed a claim but never developed it. I don't know if there's actually enough silver to make mining profitable, but the claim itself has value. Someone might buy it, or we could use it as collateral for a loan to cover what we're short. Caleb stared at the paper as if it might vanish. This could work. If we can find someone interested in the claim before the deadline. The assayer in town, Lillian said. He'd know if anyone's looking to buy claims. We should go first thing in the morning. For the first time in days, Caleb smiled. It was a small, tentative thing, but it transformed his face. You're remarkable, you know that? Most people would have given up by now. I'm not most people, Lillian said, and I don't give up when people I care about are depending on me. The words hung between them, more intimate than she'd intended. Caleb looked at her in the lamplight, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. Lillian, he began, but she stepped back, suddenly flustered. We should rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. She fled back to the house before he could say whatever he'd been about to say, her heart pounding with feelings she wasn't ready to examine. Morning came, and they left Maggie with Mrs. Henderson again before riding into town. The assayer, a German immigrant named Klaus Hoffmann, examined the claim papers with professional interest. Ja, I remember Thomas Hale bringing in samples, he said. Not enough to make big mine, but decent quality. Maybe small operation could turn profit, or maybe just enough to make someone gamble on it. He considered. I know a man in Santa Fe who buys claims sometimes, tries to flip them to mining companies. He is in town now, actually. You want I should arrange meeting? Yes, Lillian and Caleb said simultaneously. The meeting took place that afternoon in the assayer's office. The buyer was a sharp-eyed businessman named Garrett, who examined the claim papers and Hoffman's notes on the silver samples with practiced efficiency. I'll give you $40 for it, he said finally. That's generous, considering the ore quality's uncertain and the location's not ideal for large-scale operations. 50, Lillian countered immediately. Garrett laughed. You've got nerve, miss. I like that. But 40's my final offer. Take it or leave it. Lillian looked at Caleb, who nodded almost imperceptibly. $40 plus what they already had would put them over what they needed. They'd won. We'll take it, she said. The transaction was completed with handshakes and signatures. Garrett paid in cash, and they walked out of the assayer's office with everything they needed to satisfy Drummond's demand. We did it, Caleb said, disbelief evident in his voice. We actually did it. Not yet, Lillian cautioned. We still have to make the payment and make sure Drummond accepts it. He's not going to be happy about losing this fight. They went directly to the bank, where Mr. Weathers counted out their payment with meticulous care. $243, he announced. That's the full amount owed plus $3 extra. When can we make the payment to Drummond? Caleb asked. His office is open until 5 today. I'd suggest doing it immediately, in front of witnesses. A man like Drummond might try to claim the payment was late or incomplete if there's any ambiguity. They took his advice, gathering Sheriff Morrison and the blacksmith as witnesses before walking to Drummond's office. The man himself was there, his expression souring when he saw the group approaching. Mr. Drummond, Lillian said formally, we're here to settle Mr. Hale's debt in full. She laid the money on his desk, counted out precisely. Drummond's face went through several expressions, surprise, anger, calculation, before settling on cold acceptance. Count it, Sheriff Morrison said. It wasn't a suggestion. Drummond counted slowly, clearly hoping to find some discrepancy. But there was none. $240 exactly, all there, impossible to dispute. The debt is satisfied, he said finally, his voice tight. I'll prepare a receipt. I'll need that in writing, notarized, stating the debt is paid in full with no further obligations, Caleb said. And I want copies for my records and the sheriff's. Drummond's jaw clenched, but he couldn't refuse with witnesses present. He prepared the documents with barely suppressed fury, each stroke of his pen sharp enough to tear the paper. When everything was signed and notarized, Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat. There's one more matter to discuss, Drummond. That journal Thomas Hale kept? The one documenting suspicious incidents on properties you wanted to acquire? I've reviewed it thoroughly. Combined with my own records, it paints a disturbing picture. I don't know what you're talking about, Drummond said, but his voice lacked conviction. Of course you don't. But here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop your harassment campaigns. You're going to conduct your business legally and ethically from now on. And if I hear about one more convenient accident, One more suspicious fire. One more mysterious illness affecting someone's livestock. I'm going to assume it's connected to you, and I will make your life very difficult. Do we understand each other?" Drummond's face had gone red with suppressed rage. "You can't prove anything." "Maybe not today, but I'm watching now. We're all watching." Morrison gestured to the blacksmith, who nodded grimly. "You've operated in the shadows for too long, Drummond. Those days are over." They left the office in tense silence, not speaking until they were well away from Drummond's hearing. "You think that'll stop him?" Caleb asked Morrison. "For a while, at least. Men like him need darkness to operate. Once light's been shown on their methods, they have to be more careful. And careful men make mistakes." Morrison smiled grimly. "Besides, word's going to spread about how you stood up to him and won. Other people will be emboldened. Drummond's power was based partly on fear, partly on isolation. You've broken both." It was over. They'd survived. Lillian felt almost dizzy with relief as they walked back to where they'd left their horses. "Miss Moore, Mr. Hale." They turned to see Chen Wei approaching, his face creased with concern. "I heard in town about your troubles. I'm glad to see you both well." "Thanks to you," Lillian said warmly. "The money you returned from Thomas made all the difference." Chen bowed slightly. "It was only right, but I'm glad it helped." He hesitated, then continued. "I have been thinking. I am too old now to make the journey between Sacramento and New Mexico regularly. I have been looking for someone trustworthy to act as agent, to receive orders and coordinate shipments. You need income beyond cattle, yes? Perhaps we could make arrangement. I provide goods at wholesale. You distribute to ranches and territory. Small profit, but steady." Caleb and Lillian exchanged glances. It was an unexpected offer, a potential solution to their ongoing financial struggles. "We'd need to discuss details," Caleb said carefully. "But yes, we'd be interested." Good. We talk more tomorrow. Tonight, you celebrate victory." Chen smiled. Thomas would be proud of his family. As Chen walked away, Caleb turned to Lillian. "His family." He said Thomas would be proud of his family. He meant us, you and me and Maggie. "Yes," Lillian said softly. "I suppose he did." They collected Maggie from Mrs. Henderson, who hugged them both fiercely upon hearing their news. "I knew you could do it," she declared. "Both of you together, unstoppable." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, all three of them exhausted from the day's tensions. But as they crested the hill that overlooked their property, Maggie suddenly pointed. "Look! Papa! Miss Lillian! Look!" In their yard, dozens of people had gathered. The blacksmith and his sons, Sarah Wilkins and her husband in his wheeled chair, Mrs. Henderson's husband and their grown children, other ranchers and townspeople Lillian had met during her information gathering. They'd brought lumber, tools, supplies. "What's all this?" Caleb asked as they rode up. The blacksmith stepped forward. "We figured you'd need help rebuilding that barn. Can't run a ranch without one. So we're here to help raise it, if that's all right with you." Caleb looked stunned, and Lillian saw his eyes grow bright with unshed tears. "I can't ask you to—" "You didn't ask. We're offering. That's what neighbors do." The blacksmith grinned. "Besides, you stood up to Drummond and won. That deserves a barn raising if anything does." Over the next 3 days, the barn rose from the ashes of the old one. Men and women worked side by side, their children playing in the yard while Maggie directed their games like a tiny general. There was laughter and music, shared meals, and shared stories. Lillian found herself fully part of the community in a way she'd never experienced in Boston, where neighbors were strangers who happened to live nearby. She also found herself watching Caleb differently. The way he worked alongside the other men, his easy camaraderie and quiet competence, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, with an expression that made her heart skip. The way he'd started seeking her opinion on ranch decisions, trusting her judgment as a partner rather than just hired help. On the third evening, when the barn was complete and the last of the helpers had departed, they stood together on the porch as sunset painted the sky. "Your month is nearly up," Caleb said quietly. "The month we agreed on for you to decide if you wanted to stay." Lillian's chest tightened. In all the chaos, she'd forgotten about the deadline. "Yes, I suppose it is. I was thinking, sick. Caleb paused, seeming to gather courage. I was thinking that maybe we should discuss a new arrangement. What kind of arrangement? He turned to face her fully, and the vulnerability in his expression stole her breath. When Thomas wrote to you, he offered you marriage, a partnership built on honesty and mutual respect. He's gone, and I know that's not what you came here for, but... He stopped, started again. I'm not good with words like Thomas was. I can't write pretty letters or make promises sound like poetry, but I can promise you honesty. I can promise you a home and a place where you belong. I can promise you'll never be alone or unwanted again. Caleb, Lillian began, but he held up a hand. Let me finish. I know I'm not an easy man. I'm grieving and stubborn, and I've got a child who needs more than I know how to give. But these past weeks with you here, you've brought life back into this house. Not just for Maggie, though she's happier than I've seen her in 2 years, but for me too. You make me want to try again, want to believe that maybe the future doesn't have to be just surviving. He pulled something from his pocket, a simple gold band worn smooth with age. This was my mother's ring, not fancy, but it's the only thing of value I have that means anything. Lillian Moore, will you marry me? Not because you need a home or I need help with the ranch, but because we've built something here that's worth keeping. Because you've become family, and I can't imagine this place without you anymore. Lillian's vision blurred with tears. This wasn't the proposal she'd traveled across the country expecting. It wasn't the careful arrangement she'd agreed to with Thomas. It was raw and real, and offered by a man who'd learned to hope again despite every reason not to. I came here chasing a ghost, she said, her voice shaking. I came here because I had nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose. I thought I was settling for a practical arrangement because that's all life had left to offer me. Caleb's face began to close down, preparing for rejection, but she reached out and took his hand. But somewhere along the way, this stopped being about survival and started being about home, about family, about finding the place where I'm supposed to be, even if it's nothing like where I thought I was going. She looked up at him through her tears. Yes, Caleb Hale. I'll marry you, not because I need to, but because I want to. Because you and Maggie have given me something I thought I'd lost forever, a reason to hope. He slipped the ring onto her finger with trembling hands, and then he was kissing her, fierce and desperate, and full of promises neither of them knew how to speak aloud. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, they heard a squeal from the doorway. Maggie stood there, bouncing on her toes with excitement. Does this mean Miss Lillian gets to stay forever? Does this mean she's going to be my mama? Lillian knelt down and opened her arms. Maggie flew into them, and Lillian held her tight. If you'll have me, sweetheart. I know I can't replace your mother, and I won't try, but I can love you and be here for you and be the best version of a mama I know how to be. You're not replacing Mama, Maggie said seriously. You're being Miss Lillian, which is different but just as good. Mama would like you, I think. She'd be glad Papa found someone who makes him smile again. Over Maggie's head, Lillian met Caleb's eyes and saw her own emotions reflected there. Grief and hope tangled together, the past and future somehow coexisting in this single perfect moment. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with half the town in attendance. Mrs. Henderson cried through the entire service, and even the blacksmith had to wipe his eyes. Maggie stood between them, holding their hands, proud as could be in a new dress the town women had sewn for the occasion. Sheriff Morrison attended, and so did Chen Wei, who brought gifts of silk and tea from California. Even the cattle buyer Caleb had been searching for showed up, having heard the story and wanting to meet the couple who'd stood up to Drummond. Drummond himself wasn't invited, of course, but his absence was noted with satisfaction. Word had spread about his methods, and several of his business partners had quietly withdrawn their support. He was still wealthy and powerful, but his reputation was tarnished, and he'd become much more cautious in his dealings. The barn raising had become a wedding celebration, and as Lillian stood in her simple blue dress, the same one she'd arrived in, now cleaned and mended, she looked around at the faces of people who'd become family. This wasn't the life she'd planned, wasn't the future she'd imagined when she stepped off that train months ago. It was better. That night, after the guests had departed and Maggie was tucked into bed, Lillian and Caleb sat on their porch beneath a sky full of stars. The new barn stood solid and strong in the moonlight, a symbol of what they'd built together against impossible odds. "I should tell you something," Caleb said quietly. "Before we got married, I went to Thomas's grave, told him about you, about what happened, about how I was going to ask you to be my wife. I asked him if he minded, and I know that sounds foolish, talking to a gravestone, but—" "What did he say?" Lillian asked gently. "Nothing, of course, but I felt like he would have been happy. Like maybe this was what he wanted all along. Not for me to be alone, but for all of us to find each other somehow. He was always trying to fix things, trying to make everyone's life better. Maybe this was his last gift, bringing you here for me and Maggie, even if he couldn't be here himself." Lillian took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "I think you're right. I think he knew exactly what he was doing when he wrote to me. He was taking care of his family the only way he still could." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. From inside the house came the sound of Maggie talking in her sleep, her voice soft and content. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There was a ranch to run, a life to build, the constant work of survival in a hard land. But tonight, there was peace. "Thank you," Caleb said suddenly. "For what?" "For coming here, for staying, for taking a chance on a grieving widower and his lonely daughter, for fighting when it would have been easier to give up, for making me believe in second chances." Lillian leaned her head on his shoulder. "I should thank you. I came here thinking I was settling for less than I deserved, but I found more than I ever hoped for. I found home." In the distance, a coyote howled at the moon, and the horses whickered softly in their new barn. The wind carried the scent of sage and possibility across the darkening land. And on the porch of a ranch that had nearly been lost, two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely of ways sat together, planning a future that neither had expected but both had earned. Lillian thought about the woman who'd stepped off that train months ago, confused and frightened and alone. She thought about the letters from a dead man that had brought her to this impossible place. She thought about Maggie's question on that first day. "Are you the angel?" She wasn't an angel. She'd never been an angel. She was just a woman who'd lost everything and found everything again in the last place she'd thought to look. She was a wife, an almost mother, a partner and friend. Someone who belonged exactly where she was. The train had left her behind on that dusty platform, but it had delivered her exactly where she needed to be. Sometimes the wrong destination turned out to be the right one all along. Sometimes the future you didn't plan for was better than any dream you'd dared to dream. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked, feeling her shift against him. "I'm thinking," Lillian said, smiling in the darkness, "that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Finally. Completely. Home." And as the stars wheeled overhead and the desert night wrapped around them like a blessing, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.